Many child welfare professionals encounter children with various disabilities. Understanding policies and practices for supporting them at school can facilitate our collaboration with educators to better work with school-aged children. In our previous two modules, we examined educators and child welfare professionals' perceptions of the school functioning of maltreated children with mild cognitive and behavioral disabilities, and collaborations between child welfare professionals and educators in Minnesota, Japan, and South Korea. In this module, we will review federal and national policies on school-based disability support for children with mild cognitive and behavioral disabilities, such as special education in Minnesota and Japan, and examine how educators are implementing federal and national policies in their everyday practices with children at school. Here are some learning objectives. At the end of this module, we would like you to be able to become familiar with school-based disability services. We believe this will help child welfare professionals who are working with school-aged children. We will talk more about this later. Second, discuss cultural variation in the support for children with disabilities in the US and Japan. We will present our research findings in Minnesota and Japan, which will give you a broader perspective to think about the support for children with disabilities. Then reflect on your own practices and then think about any implications of the Japanese cases. Finally, discuss how you can work collaboratively with educators. Why is it necessary for child welfare professionals to learn about disability services? In Minnesota, in the 2009-10 school year, 32% of children with maltreatment histories in 3rd to 6th grade were eligible for or received special education services. This is about 3 times higher than in the general population. To better work with these children, we need to know about their disabilities and available support for them. In our research, we have focused on children with mild cognitive and behavioral disabilities. In Minnesota, 73% of children with maltreatment histories received special education services for these disabilities. We use the term mild cognitive and behavioral disabilities to refer to relatively mild disabilities, such as learning disabilities, emotional and behavioral disorders, ADHD, speech and language disabilities, and high-functioning autism, including Asperger's syndrome. In public schools in the U.S., many of these disabilities are known as high-incidence disabilities. In other words, many children in special education receive services for relatively milder disabilities. But mild does not necessarily mean that these children's struggles are mild. The mild nature of these disabilities can cause various problems, such as delaying assessment and intervention. Also, children with milder, hidden disabilities can be at increased risk of maltreatment. For example, parents and other adults may be less tolerant of children's behaviors if they don't know that these children have disabilities. Indeed, Helton and Cross found that children with relatively mild language disorders were at greater risk for physical abuse from parents than those with more obvious and more severe language disorders. Therefore, if children involved in child welfare have disabilities, collaboration between child welfare professionals and educators becomes very important. In our first module, child welfare professionals and educators discuss some benefits of cross-systems collaboration between them. For your information, we'd like to review some of those findings. First of all, by bringing different resources, perspectives, skills, and knowledge together, child welfare professionals and educators can come up with better ideas than working in isolation or individually. Cross-systems collaboration also makes it possible to provide support for children in a consistent manner. Through their collaboration, they can educate each other and expand their knowledge. However, child welfare professionals and educators described many challenges. For child welfare professionals, complicated procedures for school-based support, such as IEP procedures and meetings, and confidentiality issues make it difficult to work collaboratively with educators. For example, in many cases, unless parents invite child welfare professionals, they are not able to participate in meetings at school. If parents do not know that child welfare professionals may participate upon invitation, they may be left out. Therefore, child welfare professionals need to know about school systems so that they can educate parents and work together with educators. When we look cross-culturally at professionals in the US and Japan, some common issues emerge in their support for children with mild cognitive and behavioral disabilities. First, professionals from multiple systems, such as educators and child welfare professionals, must collaborate to provide services to multi-problem families in an integrated and coherent manner. We described this in detail in our previous module. If you are interested here is a link to the module. Another issue is that professionals must implement complex and changing national-level policies for children with mild cognitive and behavioral disabilities at the local level. We will learn more about this in this module using an example from elementary schools in Minnesota and Japan. At the end of this module, we will also discuss how these common issues are addressed in different cultural contexts. Specifically, in this module, we will first summarize briefly cultural and historical context in the US and Japan and the policies related to special education and other school-based disability services in each country. After that, we will present our research findings regarding educators' perceptions of the implementation of national policies in everyday practices at one elementary school in Minnesota, Maple Elementary School, and in Japan, Greenleaf Elementary School. We interviewed educators in these schools and asked them to describe policy requirements and procedures for the support for children with mild cognitive and behavioral disabilities, and how they implemented these policies in their everyday practices at school. Also, as you know, policies change over time. We asked educators to talk about how they navigated changing policies and practices both in Minnesota and Japan. By learning about cultural cases from Japan as well as Minnesota, you will be able to see your own practices from new perspectives. For example, you may anticipate and understand the challenges faced by educators working with children with disabilities on your caseload, such as a challenge in balancing policy requirements with everyday practices. Also, these cultural cases are helpful for you to work with children and families from culturally diverse communities on your caseload. We will begin with our findings in Minnesota. Here is a brief summary of federal policies regarding special education and other support for children with mild cognitive and behavioral disabilities in the U.S. For children who need special education services, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act (IDEA) determines eligibility criteria and procedures for evaluation and service provision. Children with mild cognitive and behavioral disabilities can receive support if they meet the eligibility criteria. Special education is provided based on their IEPs, individualized education programs. To make such decisions, multidisciplinary teams such as IEP teams including parents, classroom teachers, administrators, and other specialists such as school social workers and special education teachers are required to work together to find the best way to help each child. Again, this is a good opportunity for child welfare professionals to communicate with educators about support for children. In addition, even before children are referred to special education evaluation, they are able to receive some support in general education settings, such as through a student assistance team. If children struggle persistently with classroom-based support, they may be referred to special education evaluation. This process is called RTI, Response to Intervention. Children who do not need intensive academic assistance but require accommodations to participate in activities at school may receive support through the Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. This may be called 504 Plan at school. Support through 504 Plan is usually provided in general education settings. For example, teaching children with ADHD organization skills. Extra support within general education settings is also available through Title I of the No Child Left Behind Act. The Title I program provides extra funding for schools with high numbers of children from low-income families. Children who are struggling academically in general education classrooms receive additional reading and math instruction in small groups. Therefore, most children who struggle academically and behaviorally receive support either in their general education classrooms or through special education. However, it was very different before the 1970s. Until the Public Law 94-142, currently IDEA, was passed in 1975, access to special education was very limited, and many U.S. children with disabilities were excluded from the public education system. For example, in 1967, only 33% of children with disabilities received special education services. If children had emotional, behavioral, or physical concerns or visual and hearing impairments, they were frequently excluded from public schools. During the 1950s to 60s, two major shifts, grassroots lobbying by parents and scholars, and civil rights movement occurred, which resulted in the passage of the federal special education law in 1975. If you look at the number of children in special education, you can see the progress over the past 4 decades since 1975. During the 2011-12 school year, 13% of children aged 3 to 21 in the general population received special education services. Roughly 1 in 8 children are in special education currently. At the same time, there are some concerns regarding the increase of children receiving special education services. First, the level of special education status can change how educators look at children. By labeling them as having disabilities, educators' attention may shift away from children's interests, strengths, and specific struggles and stigmatize them, for example, as underachievers. Second, the traditional model of identifying children with learning disabilities, discrepancy model, could delay their identification. Most children with learning disabilities are identified by third grade, but by the time they are identified, they have already experienced academic challenges for an extended period of time. Early identification and intervention are necessary. Third, children from ethnic minority groups, especially African American and Native American children, are overrepresented in special education. They may be unnecessarily placed in special education in part because of cultural biases in standardized tests and educator perceptions. And finally, the increased number of children in special education has resulted in financial burdens for states and local communities. To decrease inappropriate special education referrals, the IDEA amendment in 2004 included the concept of RTI. RTI is intended for early identification of children with learning disabilities, but this made it possible to identify children with other mild cognitive and behavioral disabilities and provide interventions early on, which can also result in prevention of further problems and can decrease the number of special education referrals. At Maple Elementary School in Minnesota, we interviewed 18 educators, including administrators, special and general education teachers, a school social worker, and other staff members. Maple Elementary School is a middle-sized school. About half of the students were white, and 40% of students were from low-income families. During the school year, we interviewed educators. 9% of children received special education services. The first challenge educators are dealing with is balancing legal requirements in everyday practices with children. Here is a brief summary of educators' responses at Maple Elementary School. As you remember, the initial federal special education law was implemented to respond to lobbying and lawsuits. Therefore, the law was intended to ensure access of all children with disabilities to a free and appropriate public education. Every effort was made to protect the rights of children, including mediation and due process. Also, the law and its regulations describe detailed procedures educators have to follow to provide support for children. In describing policies, educators indicated that consistency in implementation of the law is one of the strengths of the current policy and special education system. For example, a classroom teacher described positive changes. My grandma often talks about my aunt with disabilities. My grandma was told she needs to be in an institution, and my grandma was like, no, she's going to go to school. I'm so grateful for the progress that we've made for the kids' sake. The opportunity to be engaged in the school system is critical. However, at the practice level, complicated procedures to provide special education may make it difficult to flexibly attend to children's changing needs. For example, many educators at Maple Elementary School expressed frustration due to limited time, staff members, and funding to complete paperwork. Especially educators who are directly involved in special education expressed feelings of pressure and frustration with paperwork that they thought negatively affected their ability to teach. A special education teacher described, "We need to instruct children the best way possible and not worry about the paperwork and the law and the process and the policies. But I feel like the state requires so much paperwork that it hinders the actual instruction happening in the classroom." Many educators also described challenges caused by the strong focus on children's academic achievement measured by test scores, which is a requirement by the No Child Left Behind Act and the IDEA. A classroom teacher expressed her frustration. "We have to push these kids to prepare them for a standardized test when we should be working on a whole variety of skills that will prepare them for life." The second challenge educators discussed was adjusting to policy shifts to provide specialized support within general education settings. The recent U.S. policy shifts are toward more support in general education settings to strengthen prevention and early intervention and decrease unnecessary referrals to special education. Educators at Maple Elementary School supported the shift toward classroom-based intervention. This school has implemented a student assistance team (SAT) to provide support for children who struggle academically and behaviorally in general education settings. The principal stated, "I bet 80% of the kids that come through SAT are doing well and never reach special education. We are not the gateway to special education. We are there to make sure that we work with families and students who are struggling and keep them out of special education." Educators described that this shift to classroom-based intervention also re-emphasizes the importance of social and emotional aspects of children's learning. Many classroom teachers prefer the interventions within general education settings because children with disabilities still can interact with their peers and learn from each other. A classroom teacher observed, "If there's any possible way that you could teach and keep these students in their regular classroom where they feel the safest and at home, which is what we want with our kids. If they need to meet with a social worker, a school psychologist, it can be at a time where they aren't missing critical things in the classroom, and not just the academics, but the social aspect." But educators indicated a lot of challenges, including a lack of training and resources such as support teachers and other educators who can provide specialized interventions within and outside of general education classrooms. The principal observed, "That's been very stressful for classroom teachers. I think it's the right thing to do, but as an administrator, I'm looking at what other support systems I need to have in place for teachers." Educators also indicated inadequate level of collaboration and communication between classroom teachers and other specialists, such as special education teachers. For example, one classroom teacher described his relationships with specialists as the island system. On the other hand, specialists and administrators expressed challenges due to classroom teachers' lack of understanding about their roles and disagreements between them. The third challenge is negotiating support within and outside of general education classrooms. Again, the recent policy shifts are from individualized support to classroom-based support. Because of the long history of providing individualized support since 1975, educators at Maple Elementary School understood that some children could benefit from pull-out interventions outside of their general education classrooms. They tended to understand specialized support as part of a child's right to receive an appropriate education, although many of them preferred classroom-based interventions. A Title I reading teacher described, "I know it stinks to have them pulled out of class so much, but it just really does help. You can see they do make a lot of progress that they probably wouldn't have made in their general education classrooms. I think they make a lot more progress having this specialized skill set." However, rigid eligibility criteria for receiving special education created a challenge. Most educators discuss that some children who are clearly struggling do not meet the special education criteria or have not yet been referred to special education. A special education teacher explained, "There are lots of students who need support, and there's strict criteria that has to be met in order for a student to be able to receive these extra services. For those children who really need it, sometimes they just don't qualify, and so that's a struggle." Although these children still are able to receive interventions in general education settings, some children continue struggling and may wait for several years to be re-evaluated for special education. In summary, at Maple Elementary School, clear policy requirements and procedures provide consistency in implementation, but rigid policy requirements results in inflexibility in practice. In the U.S., support for children with mild cognitive and behavioral disabilities is shifting to more general education-based support. Educators at Maple Elementary School supported this shift, but at the practice level, to make it happen, educators struggle with inadequate resources and collaboration among educators. Educators at Maple Elementary School understand that specialized support provided outside of general education classroom is part of a child's right to an appropriate education. Still, some children who are struggling are left out in general education classrooms because of strict policy requirements. Japan has special education systems very different from those of the US. But educators at Greenleaf Elementary School discussed some similar challenges to those at Maple Elementary School in Minnesota. First, balancing legal requirements in everyday practice with children. 2. Adjusting to policy shifts to provide specialized support within general education settings. And 3. Negotiating support within and outside of general education classrooms. We will briefly review Japanese special education systems for children with mild cognitive and behavioral disabilities and discuss how educators at Greenleaf Elementary School understand these challenges. Similar to the US, Japanese laws describe school-based support for children with mild cognitive and behavioral disabilities. Nationally, special education services for children with mild cognitive and behavioral disabilities became formally available in 2007. Prior to the amendment, special education focused primarily on children with moderate to severe disabilities in special education classrooms and schools. Currently, specialized support for children with mild cognitive and behavioral disabilities is primarily provided by classroom teachers, special education teachers, and other educators at local public schools. In addition, at the local level, some cities and schools have implemented support education, which includes educational support for children who struggle for many other reasons, including their family environments and child maltreatment. In this model, disability is understood as one of many challenges children are facing. Again, in Japan, special education services for children with mild cognitive and behavioral disabilities are relatively new, started in 2007. We can understand why it took so long or it was so late by examining Japanese culture and historical context. After World War II, the Japanese government experienced major reforms including reorganization of public education systems. The government created the new law describing public education, which included special education, but there were limited resources to implement them. The priority was on special education for children with severe disabilities who were excluded from public education. Although the government had noticed the presence of children with mild cognitive and behavioral disabilities who struggled in general education classrooms without adequate support. The Japanese government and educators also were very careful about stigmatization as a result of providing special education services for children with mild cognitive and behavioral disabilities who look normal and function well in many areas. In addition, the Japanese traditional educational practice at elementary schools allow these children with mild cognitive and behavioral disabilities to receive some support from their classroom teachers and peers to some extent. For example, in Japan, children's interactions with peers and educators were understood as an important context for their learning. Teachers' instructions are designed so that children's learnings occur through their participation in all activities at school, not only during academic instruction. Japanese elementary education is also holistic. Classroom teachers assume broader roles and teach social and emotional skills as well as academic skills. Therefore, it is only recently that local public schools started to place school social workers and psychologists in their school building. At Greenleaf Elementary School, we interviewed 15 educators. We also interviewed 11 additional educators in other cities to enhance the credibility of our analysis. Participant educators included administrators, special and general education teachers, and other staff members. Greenleaf Elementary School is a small-sized school in one of the largest cities in Japan. Most students were from middle-class Japanese families. Also, there were several children from immigrant or bicultural families. Although 10% of all children were recommended for specialized support, only 3% of children received special education services during the year we conducted interviews with educators. Educators at Greenleaf Elementary School discussed the first challenge, balancing legal requirements in everyday practices with children. Unlike U.S. laws, Japanese laws do not determine specific procedures or significant consequences for not implementing new policies for the support of children with mild cognitive and behavioral disabilities. The primary strength indicated by educators was that they can flexibly and creatively attend to the needs of individual children. For example, some educators reported utilizing local community resources, such as community members and parent volunteers to assist classroom teachers. At the same time, the ambiguous law created a challenge. The extent to which policies are implemented depends on resources available and administrators' understandings of disabilities and policies, both at the level of individual schools and cities. For example, a classroom teacher described, "When I was in a school where the principal and other teachers understood very well about special education, we were able to have constructive conversations, but there still are people among teachers who believe that children act out because of a lack of teacher skills. Unfortunately, it's sad. Actually, there are administrators who have such an idea, so I think it must be hard for teachers to work under these administrators." The second challenge, adjusting to policy shifts to provide specialized support within general education settings. Opposite to the US, the new special education system in Japan was intended to provide specialized support for more children who potentially have mild cognitive and behavioral disabilities, either within or outside of the general education classrooms. As a result of the implementation of new systems, educators reported increased resources and awareness of children's disabilities. For example, an administrator described, "In the past, there was a sort of invisible pressure on children who struggled. I see less and less recently. It used to be that children had to bear the discomfort within peer groups and remain silent." Educators also described that increased support for classroom teachers and collaboration helped them to address children's individual needs and providing more effective educational support. A classroom teacher observed a shift in educators' roles. "Now administrators tell us, let's work together with such children who are struggling. It used to be that behavioral problems in classrooms had to be dealt with within their classrooms, and then when teachers couldn't handle and lost control. Also, we didn't have such people like support teachers and volunteers, so classroom teachers had to deal with it themselves. Now we have someone who can support us, and I appreciate that." However, educators discussed that such support is not enough yet. There are classroom teachers who are still struggling. A classroom teacher observed, "The reason why they can't adjust to new policies is because even if they want support from administrators or other people, schools have a limited number of staff members." Another classroom teacher also discussed that the support they received might not be specific enough so they can use in their classrooms. This teacher stated, "There are many people available with whom I can consult, but that really helps, but I feel that there is not specific enough idea to solve problems. Then only what I can do is never give up and keep encouraging children." Also, even if support is available, some classroom teachers may be hesitant to make use of resources, in part because of Japanese cultural practices related to shame. They are concerned that if they ask for help, they may be labeled as not performing at the level they are expected to. The third challenge, negotiating support within and outside of general education classrooms as a result of the shift to individualized support. Many educators discuss that the recent implementation of new special education practices has changed their perceptions of support provided outside of general education classrooms. Some teachers initially were concerned about the impact of removing children from their classrooms even for part-time support, as they observed that children receiving throughout support functioned better and learned more about special education. Their perceptions shifted. A support teacher reflected, "In the past, we didn't know about this kind of disability, so these children grew up without knowing that they have such disabilities. They faced real problems once they got into the outside world." When I read about that, I thought if we can identify that kind of child, then we can come up with appropriate ways of educating them. In the long term, it will be better for them. Within general education classrooms, teachers incorporated individualized support within the traditional model of classroom instruction, which is similar to a universal design of teaching. For example, providing support helpful to all children, not just those with disabilities. A special education teacher observed that a little help, such as clear and short directions and color-coded descriptions on the blackboard, can help most children to understand and follow directions. Then teachers have some extra time to work individually with children who still are struggling. With this support system, some children still need individualized support, but they may be left in general education classrooms because of the lack of resources. A special education coordinator described, "We created the special support room to provide pull-out support for children in general education classrooms. But the number of children studying there hasn't increased, or we intentionally haven't increased the number. Considering the availability of staff members and how to use their time, we can't initiate conversations with parents of new children. If we can't provide enough support to these children, parents will lose trust in us." In addition, parental resistance because of stigma regarding special education is still strong in Japan, even if they are aware of the benefits of receiving specialized support. A first-grade classroom teacher described a child with behavioral problems and his parents' reaction. "There is a child who has a support teacher. He can calm down if the support teacher takes him to another room. But his parents do not understand. We haven't been able to get parent permission to do so. They asked us and insisted that we keep him in his general education classroom." In such situations, even if support outside of their classroom is preferable, without parental permission, educators have to do their best in their general education classrooms. In summary, Japanese laws that do not provide clear requirements allow educators flexibility and creativity in implementing support for children with disabilities. However, this can result in inconsistency in implementation across schools and cities. Policy shifts in support for children with mild cognitive and behavioral disabilities in Japan is shifting to more specialized support. Due to a lack of resources, parental resistance, and stigma, at Greenleaf Elementary School, as much as possible and appropriate, specialized support is provided in general education settings. For example, some educators implemented universal design of teaching in general education classrooms. Here is a summary of educators' responses in Minnesota and Japan. The first challenge expressed by educators was balancing legal requirements with everyday practices. In both Minnesota and Japan, educators discussed challenges in navigating changing legal requirements while attending to the needs of individual children. But national special education laws in the US and Japan provide different levels of specificity and procedural guidelines. US laws are relatively fixed and less flexible, but provide clear guidelines and procedures. Japanese laws are relatively flexible, which allows educators creativity in implementing policies, but this can result in inconsistency in implementation. The second challenge was adjusting to policy shifts to support children with disabilities within general education settings. Policies in the US and Japan are shifting into different directions. US policies are shifting to more classroom-based support, while Japanese policies are shifting in more specialized support. Still, in both Minnesota and Japan, educators described similar challenges to local implementation, such as a lack of training, collaboration, and support for general classroom teachers. The third challenge was negotiating support for children within and outside of their classrooms. Educators in both Minnesota and Japan expressed their preferences of supporting children with mild cognitive and behavioral disabilities within general education classrooms. But they also understand that support outside of their classroom is necessary for some children. Educators were especially concerned about children who could benefit from pull-out instruction but who are left out in general education classrooms. In Minnesota, some children who are persistently struggling are left out because of strict eligibility criteria for special education. In Japan, some children with disabilities are left in general education classrooms because of a lack of resources or parental resistance. Also, it is very important to remember that these differences in educators' responses are also because of cultural differences in beliefs about disability and educational goals and practices. Implications for child welfare professionals. First, advocate for systems change so that more information may be shared between child welfare professionals and educators. Currently, to maintain confidentiality, information exchange between child welfare and school system is somehow limited. As child welfare professionals' involvement in the IEP process may be limited, educators may not even know about a child's involvement in child welfare system. It is necessary to advocate for systems change for more information sharing. For example, some counties have implemented a school child welfare liaison. Educate caregivers. According to the IDEA and the state statute, caregivers can invite child welfare professionals to their children's IEP meetings. If children on your caseload receive special education, participating in IEP meetings will allow you to initiate conversations with educators and discuss how each may best support the children. To participate in IEP meetings, caregivers have to sign the consent at school. Third, understand that educators may be experiencing many challenges in providing support for children with disabilities. These challenges appear to be culturally widespread in the US and Japan, for example, adjusting to changing policies, a lack of support and training, collaboration between educators, and balancing policy requirements with children's individual needs, which might be similar to challenges experienced by child welfare professionals. Therefore, it is necessary to understand the resources available for educators to collaborate with child welfare professionals. After learning about school-based support for children with mild cognitive and behavioral disabilities, we'd like you to take a moment to think about your own practices with children with disabilities. Again, just like child welfare professionals are working in child welfare and other social service organizations, educators are also working within a system. Both child welfare professionals and educators are handling system-level issues in their everyday practices with children. With this in mind, please reflect on your own practice experiences. Here are some of the questions for you to think about. What are constraints when working with children with disabilities? For example, do you have any similar challenges and concerns to those expressed by educators? What issues do you think you need to share when communicating with educators? What do you want to hear more from educators? Next, here are questions we'd like you to think about based on what you have learned from these US and Japanese cultural cases. Similar to Japan, disability is a sensitive issue in the US, especially when communicating with the parents of children on your caseload. How do you balance the risk of stigmatization with a child's right to receive appropriate education and other services? Second, as we have seen in the US and Japanese cases, flexibility and consistency can become both strengths and challenges. In your everyday practices with children and their families, how do you handle flexibility and consistency? For more information, these journal articles and the book describe more details of the project.